Good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Black Ass Our History Presents Y'all Late to the Revolution. We are in our final chapter of Y'all Late to the Revolution. This is chapter 4, Waxing Poetics, Melanin Prophetic. This is our Black arts movement. And today we're going to be learning about how they were driving our justice. Disclaimer: content, images, and language that you're about to experience may be offensive and may lead to triggers. Viewer discretion is advised. Black Ass Art History is committed and dedicated to educating its audiences on the diaspora of melanated people with the intent to provide an honest and holistic history of our narratives. We are committed to ensuring our history and stories are not filtered through white supremacy, indoctrination, dogma, or pseudo-social science. So let's get started about jiving our justice. I would like to say this is a very high overview of summarizing what is about 20 years of what we consider to be the civil rights movement. And as an art historian, and educator, it is imperative that I provide context and framework of the visual art that we will see, what's inspired it, and how it is impacted not only by the civil rights movement, but the Black Power movement. So let's get into some timeline. So Hattie McDaniel becomes the first person to win an Academy Award. She was won for Best Supporting Actress as an enslaved maid to Scarlett O'Hara in the film Gone with the Wind. Dr. Charles Drew discerns plasma as a replacement for blood and established the first blood banks. He goes on to save the lives of many soldiers during the World War because of the blood banks. We also have the arrival of the Tuskegee Airmen. Core of the Congressional of Racial Equality is established in Chicago. FDR Executive Order 8802. It was desegregating war production plan and also established the Fair Employment Practices Committee. The U.S. Supreme Court rules segregation on interstate bus travel is unconstitutional. We also have Jackie Robinson integrating the Major League Baseball. In 1947, W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP submitted an appeal for racism. This is entitled An Appeal to the World, a statement of the denial of human rights to minority in the United States. So now we have racism being brought specifically towards African Americans as well as our humanity to United Nations. And then lastly, President Truman's Executive Order 9981 desegregated the armed forces. So it was a lot of things that were going on in the 40s. And of course, it would continue on to the 50s. So we have Chuck Cooper, Nathaniel Clifton, and Earl Lloyd become the first Americans to play in the NBA. Ralph Waldo Ellison releases The Invisible Man. We have African American freedom movements with Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and others formed the Americans for South African Resistance, later American Committee on Africa. Think about Africa. We talked about the Berlin Conference, as well as how Africa has been split up and is colonized by these European powers. Marian Anderson becomes the first Black singer to sing at the New York Metropolitan Opera. And lastly, we also have in 1952, Tuskegee Institute is reporting that there hasn't been a lynching for the first time in 70 years. I think it's important to also bring in the impact of the Nation of Islam. Although founded on the 4th of July in 1934 in Detroit, Michigan, the Nation of Islam impact still grows to this very day. Every decade, it continues to teach the importance of Black people's knowledge of self and self-love, as well as history, education, community, and collaboration. And so let's learn about the one and only Mr. Wallace Farr Humor, Muhammad, excuse me. He would actually gain his audience as well and educating people. When he was a door-to-door salesman, I believe he sold wool and silk. And he would often ask family when he's educating them if they would like to know more. Soon he would gain the audience by having meetings teaching Black folks that they were the children of the lost tribe of Shabazz. He spoke, but more importantly, he spoke about not centering whiteness, but to understand who we are as a people, that Islam was our true religion, Arabic was our true language, that we abandon the names that we have and instead go for like Muhammad and so forth. Ultimately, again, he's teaching knowledge of self as well. However, as his following grew to the point it grew to the point that they were concerned with others. Others were concerned with controversies, and they were outside labeling them as voodoo and cult. Elijah Noble, then, who is now Elijah Muhammad, was F.W. Muhammad's chosen one to continue on the teachings. And as the believers and converts continue to grow, local Detroit politicians were becoming suspicious of the organization was a threat. And Elijah Muhammad would leave for Chicago, and W.F. Muhammad, just kind of, his story is interesting. We know that he was still alive because he was still in communication with Elijah Muhammad. But again, ultimately, the Nation of Islam promoted that Black people be in charge of every aspect of their own well being, their health, mentality, religion, neighborhoods, business, education, etc. I also want to bring in the amazing wife and husband duo, Dr. Kenneth Clark and Dr. Mamie Clark. They were the first African Americans to obtain their PhD in psychology from Columbia University. They are also the creators of the doll test. These tests were conducted on Black children between the ages of 3 and 7, and they used black and white dolls along with a series of questions where they asked, which is the good doll, which is the bad doll, now which doll looks like you. And additional, it was them bringing to the fact that because of racism and discrimination, the psychological development of these young children was already in them, that they were inferior and that these negative notions were being internalized. So let's talk about the ugliness we faced. Hitler Brooks was a World War II veteran living in Montgomery, Alabama. On August 12, 1950, he boarded the bus and paid his fare at the front of the bus. The bus driver advised that he needs to exit and also enter at the rear. He refuses. He's frustrated. I've paid you money already. Why can't I just walk to the back of the bus? Officer Emmy Hills is called in at the scene. White people at the time felt intimidated. They felt threatened. Apparently, they said he was intoxicated. That hasn't been corroborated. However, he's resisting arrest and just being obedient. He's causing a nuisance and uproar. Officer Emmy Mills shoots him. Unfortunately, Brooks would die the next day due to complications of the gun wound. Emmett Till. Born on the south side of Chicago in 1941, Till enjoyed attention, especially when he's joking around. He was a kid. He was a jokester. He was a teenage boy. However, his mother, Mammy, knew this behavior well and cautioned him about it and saying, like, you can't be like this towards white people. So in the summer, I believe he was visiting family in Mississippi, and Till and his cousins went to a grocery store where a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, worked at the register. Apparently or supposedly, his cousins dared him to talk to her. And although we don't know exactly what occurred, it was said that Till either whistled at her, he spoke to her, and or he touched her wrist. That night, Carolyn Bryant talked about the interaction with her husband, Roy. Roy and his half brother would go to the family's house, go to Till's family house and kidnap him. Till was beaten to the point that he was unrecognizable. His eyes were gouged out. He was also then shot dead and taken to the Tallahatchie River. There he was strapped to a metal fan with barbed wire and put into the river. His body was found 3 days later. So this happened, I believe, on August 28th. Post the kidnapping, which was the 31st, those two men were arrested and charged with murder. The manner in which they were able to identify him was Mammy was able to see his ring he had a monogram ring engraved, and that was on his finger. That's how she was able to tell that it was Emmett. At his funeral, Mammy decided to have the casket open, and she stated, "Let the people see what they did to my boy." Images of his disfigured face and body would be in such publications like Jet Magazine. Y'all keep in mind, this is the body of a 14-year-old boy. It is swollen up and disfigured to the point that it looks like a grown man, but this is a 14-year-old boy. Now, to make all of this worse, um, Carolyn Bryant, although she is dead, was not honest about the interaction. In a CNN report in 2005, Carolyn Bryant was actually interviewed by a retired FBI agent named Dale Killinger. She stated that the night that they kidnapped Till, he was brought to her house, and she really didn't remember the interaction, and she couldn't even identify if Till was the boy. So before I move into this, I want to advise this. I just wanted to kind of give an extremely high overview of these two gentlemen's policies. It is important. It is important, and I cannot stress this enough. The complexity and fullness of these two great men, that both El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm X, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. desired the same thing for Black people, and that was freedom, equality, equity, and our rights. However, they did have different approaches, and they're often polarized against each other. But I do also want to highlight how they did impact each other throughout their lives. So Malcolm grew up experiencing trauma, including racial trauma, whether it's from the Ku Klux Klan, his dad and four uncles being murdered, his mother ending up in a mental institution, and as a preteen trying to survive, being labeled as a delinquent, serving in a juvenile center. Malcolm Little becomes Detroit Red, so you kind of get the notion that Malcolm had to struggle and fend for his life since youth. Meanwhile, Dr. King comes from a prominent family where the father, Martin Luther King Jr. Sr., becomes is pastor of one of the most important churches in Atlanta, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and he also came from the comforts of a middle class family. So when we think about their ideologies, um, although many people felt Malcolm X was an extremist in comparison to Dr. King, um, and he's also considered a Black separatist. And so is the Nation of Islam. But ultimately, it shouldn't be separatist. It was just Black power. Malcolm felt that white folks would never acknowledge the humanity or dignity of Black people, and just to have our own thriving communities that took care of themselves. And ultimately, we just couldn't trust the white man. Dr. King, on the other hand, truly believed in equality for all human beings and believed that we can thrive together holistically and live harmoniously and peacefully. So their approaches, by any means necessary, is often taken out of context. Malcolm X was not proactively stating we should war and attack white folks. He did say that we should practice self-defense by any means necessary. However, it would seem that history still teaches that. It's getting a little better, but that of Brother Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, as if they were preparing some sort of attack. No, it was just leave us the hell alone. But what probably scared white folks was the Nation of Islam's and Malcolm X's uncanny ability to structure and to organize, and the knowledge that they imputed on Black folks. Now, Dr. King is a pastor, and in his good conscience believed that nonviolence was morally right. At the time, it was also the strategy that seemed to be most beneficial, because if we think about sheer numbers of population of Black folks and white folks at this time, would Black people successfully be able to defend or wage any intolerance against white people? Yet the two of them would influence each other. When Malcolm X took his Hajj to Mecca, he was shocked to see Black, white, Asian, Indian, all races were walking together around the Kaaba. And this opened his eyes and changed his trajectory, realizing the importance of how humans are really, truly connected. Dr. King would soon realize two things. One, that the riots, even as violent as they become, are actually a method to garnish attention, and they do have some place as a purpose of an agency of change. However, it would be his famous words, "I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house." King soon realizes that the morality of what he believed existed in the United States was long gone. So how is this change going to come? Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, would be founded in 1957. Among the voter registration and organizing that they did, They are most will be responsible for the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 56. This was a 381-day protest where Black folks of Montgomery avoided the bus. They carpooled, they walked, they did whatever that they needed to do. At the time, African American population were the largest demographic taking the bus. So when they lost all that money, yeah, you hit somebody in their pockets, they're going to start to listen. We also have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or also known as SNCC. Students, they led organization 1960s to continue to push of civil rights, including integration and voting. They would lead the sit-ins at counters, registration for voting, and mobilize in these activities. The Freedom Riders were in 1961, and then Freedom Summer, which was a coordinated effort, was in 1964. I do want to point out SNCC, as the youngers, did have some fundamental differences with the SCLC. They felt like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference wasn't bold enough, and that they did things in moderation. And more importantly, they were too heavily dependent on white liberals for assistance, for support, for help, and to work with them. So I do want to talk about that there were some civil rights acts and executive orders in the 50s. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was prosecutes those who violated the people's right to vote. Okay, here's the problem with that. That language in itself has some nuance in it. And the only reason it passed, and that's when it became worthless, is that the Senate passed it just fine. However, the House at the time was like, we're not signing it until you remove this clause about disenfranchisement. And when they removed it, they signed it. So that just null and void the whole purpose of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Then there was the Executive Order 10730 on September 23, 1957. President Eisenhower mandates National Guard troops to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So now we get the Central High School 9 or the Little Rock 9 as well. And these would be the first students to integrate a school. Side note, I think the reason that too, I'm just putting this out there, and it's this kind of history that's imperative to learn, and many folks don't want to be passed as critical race theory, which it isn't critical race theory because critical race theory is a graduate course. However, I think the fear is that these photographs existed, and some folks are a little nervous to see themselves in these photographs, but I digress. The atrocities that Black people would face by white folks in the form of peaceful protest is criminal and inhumane, especially in Alabama, where you had Governor George Wallace and the Commissioner of Public Safety for Alabama, Montgomery, Bull Connor, who I often refer to as Satan and Hitler of the South, really were all for segregation. Even with freedom riders and peaceful protest assistance, Black people were treated the same way as if slavery was still in full effect, that we were inferior, that we were ignorant, and therefore we were not human. So everything from being attacked by dogs, having being pushed and shoved, having condiments poured on us at sitting counters, being carried away by police with extreme force, and of course, let us not forget the extremely pressurized hose from the fire hoses being sprayed on us as well. So let's talk about the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. So on August 28th, 1963, Dr. King would give his remarkable and most well-known speech, the I Have a Dream speech, at the National Mall. Over 250,000 people would attend, coming by plane, train, bus, carpool, even walking. This incredible moment was brought together in collaboration with many Black leaders and Black leaderships, including A. Philip Randolph, who was a founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Roy Wilkins, the executive director of the NAACP, Whitney Young, SCLC, SNCC, and countless other unions and civil rights organizations. Yet, it would be the genius of civil rights strategist Bayard Rustin that this will all happen. So Rustin is your favorite organizer. He organized this march as well as many other social movements on nonviolence, on socialism, and gay rights. And this man was an activist at birth. Even in his younger days, post college, he worked on the defense for the Scottsboro Boys. These were the 9 young black men who had been charged, were being charged with raping 2 white women. He loved to work with young activists. It energized them and it gave him energy. But because Rustin was an openly gay black man, he often was in the background and as a counselor and advisor to black organizations and civil rights movements. But this is why Bayard is considered to be one of the most brilliant strategists, especially in the arena of civil rights. These are just a few pages from his organizing manual, and there were actually two. This is manual 2, there's manual 1. And this was also created alongside with Cleveland Robinson, specifically for the March on Washington. It is heavily detailed with the do's and do nots for this march, but also things such as how do we arrive to DC? What's the departure going to be like from DC? How do we ensure the children are safe? What are the signs? What are the mentioned phrases that we can use? What's the food and health and sanitation like? How do I get to DC? It was just absolutely detailed and amazing. And you can actually Google this and just download the manual to read it in its full capacity. But it was because of this that this march was so thorough and organized. So we're going to talk about the Selma marches that were occurring in Selma. And these were just peaceful protests to get the voting rights going. It had been a committed effort to get more Black people to be registered to vote, particularly in Alabama, where the registration of African Americans to vote was about 2%. So on March 7th, 1965, John Lewis, who was the chairman of SNCC, Reverend Hosea Williams of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Amelia Boynton, whose family was instrumental in this, and around 600 others were leading the march for votings from Selma, Alabama, to the Capitol stairs of Montgomery, Alabama. Dealing with vehement racism and the power of both Governor Wallace and Bull Connor, this peaceful protest would end in bloodshed. The march was going well until they approached Edmund Pettus Bridge. They were met with extreme aggression of the law enforcement, and these officers were on foot as well as horseback. Because the protesters would not budge from the march and proceeded the bridge, they were viciously attacked. John Lewis would have a fractured skull. Amelia Boynton would be beaten till she was no longer conscious, and around 60 other people would suffer injuries. These events that had happened that day were actually televised for all America to see. And this would spearhead a second march. So after the horrors of Bloody Sunday making its way across TV sets in the United States, many religious leaders from all denominations, pastors, priests, rabbis, and more lended their support in this effort. Within a matter of weeks, the second march from Selma to Montgomery was organized. Now, they were trying to coordinate and let Lyndon B. Johnson, listen, this is something you want to be a part of because it's not just Black folks on this now. You got white folks are going to be attacked if something happens. You have rabbis, you have America at this point getting ready to be attacked. People try to stop Dr. King that day from marching. But the morning of the march, King and others and the original folks that were there in February would march that day. Around 2,500 people of all nationalities went from Selma to Montgomery. Although it was peaceful on their side, and although nobody was attacked in droves, there were still people like the Ku Klux Klan would beat and attack 3 white Unitarian Universalist pastors. But the one that experienced the most was a white pastor named James Reed. He was from Boston. He sustained the worst of it all. 2 days later, he would succumb to his injuries in the hospital in Alabama, and his wife was there with him. Now, during this march, President Lyndon B. Johnson did state that he would get the voting bills right on the table. Although it took him to March 15th to do it, it did get complete. So we got rights, right? So, the Civil Rights Act was actually signed in 1964 by President Kennedy. This act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And the following year, with Johnson, was the 1965 the Voting Rights Act. It's a landmark piece of federal legislation in the U.S. that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. So, a quick recap. Post the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro Movement era, Black folks slowly began to integrate previously segregated offices and institutions as well as earning graduate level degrees continuously. Like the New Negro Movement, organizations were founded as the movement for the civil rights team picked up. Not all Black people were for integration. Some forecast this might be detrimental to the community. Um, Black people continue to suffer just for being Black as the quest for freedom and integration pushed forward. Through lots of blood and loss of lives, our spirit was relentless. So legislation was passed to ensure the rights for humanity. However, today there are folks still challenging the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I hope you all enjoyed the the first part of chapter 4 of Jive and Our Justice, and stay tuned as we get into the meat and potatoes to what launches the Black Power movement and the Black Arts movement. Have a great day.